watching Property TV.
Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is a programme where you can have all your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. And joining me today are Hayley Andrews, CEO of Your Freedom Empire and property investor. Hayley, hi.
Hello.
Good trip down from Birmingham.
Very good. I like the emphasis on the hat.
Yeah, well, just try and do things a little bit differently on the show. Yeah. So did you drive down or catch the train?
Drove.
Right, okay. That was pretty uneventful, was it?
Yes, it was.
Good, okay. Well, you're going to get your HS2, aren't you? So you'll be able to zoom up and down in
Maybe
half an
not
hour.
in my lifetime, but...
I think we're all feeling a bit that way about the London Crossrail, aren't we? I think
Very much so.
Okay. Well, on your right is David Galman, Director of Galliard Homes. I think now London's biggest private developer, I think. Is that right, David?
That's correct. That's what
Good.
they say about us.
Okay, well, this is your second show, so welcome back. Good to have
you.
you back again. Thank you for coming in. And we'll get straight on with the questioning. Hayley, do you think it would be sensible for landlords to be subjected to a competence test before being allowed to offer properties to rent? This may help to cut down the number of rogue landlords and assist genuine ones, given the number of rules, regulations and responsibilities that now apply in law to the industry. There you go.
Ooh. Why do we always highlight or headline rogue landlords? I mean, in my experience, I see a hell of a lot more rogue tenants than I do landlords, but I'll answer the question anyway. I mean, the very definition of rogue, whether it's landlord or tenant.
I wonder how many tenants we'll have writing in there.
Feel free to write it. The very definition of rogue is someone that doesn't abide by the rules. So putting more rules in place, and I don't think is the answer. But that being said, to answer the question, I don't think it would be a bad idea for landlords that are self-managing to understand their legal responsibility as a landlord. There's a lot of legislation, and to protect themselves as well as their tenants, they should know what to adhere to in order to be compliant, etc. So I don't think it would be a bad idea. I don't think that bringing, testing or qualifications or anything like that would be the right route to go down, but perhaps a course that they have to sit or something like that.
Well, do you know what? I think you sort of almost by accident tripped on the answer there. That seems to me to be sensible. I wonder whether a compromise would be is that either you take some kind of competence course to make you aware of all this legislation and your responsibilities, or alternatively, you must appoint a qualified agent,
yes.
Competent agent.
Yeah.
I think that might be a good solution.
A lot of landlords will actually go down that route, so they have no desire to be, to self-manage. So we're talking about, I think, personally, a small percentage here. But those that don't know what they are doing, accidentally fall into becoming a landlord and have zero idea of their responsibility, that is dangerous. So I do think for themselves, they should understand. And a course would be, perhaps a course that they have to sit, and then they get a certificate to say that they understand their legal responsibility. Of course, creates a safer place for them as a landlord, because if paperwork and things like that is not in place, or their tenancy hasn't been issued correctly or properly, that process hasn't been handled correctly, they will struggle to get possession of that property should they need to. So I think, yes, for the protection of the tenants, but also for the protection of yourself as a landlord. If you are self-managing, make sure you understand your legal responsibility. I
mean, I have to say, I was most disturbed the other day. I saw, I think it was a Common Select Committee were interviewing a number of housing association bosses who'd been criticised for running absolutely appalling properties, absolutely appalling. And, listening to the conversation, I was really wondering whether these chief executives were either above the management of the properties, in other words, they delegated it down and the people down the line were perhaps not competent or whatever. But it was really shocking to hear and to look at some of the film footage of these properties that people were being expecting to live in. And these are people who, I would say, genuinely in life are not able to complain, or you're right, they're vulnerable.
Vulnerable
aren't they?
Tenants, yeah,
And,
absolutely. There are situations like that, and of course, it would be great to protect those people. I just think that that is more of a minority than the majority, and most landlords actually do it right.
Interestingly, what you're discussing there is the housing association, so supposedly professional landlords.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that tenants fall into that trap of living in a housing association block that isn't well managed.
Yeah.
That should never be the case. You can imagine it being the case in a private landlord having 1 or 2 properties and just being, to quote that word, rogue, which isn't particularly nice. But within housing association and local authority, it should never happen.
No.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was always taught, growing up, that, in business, you follow the money. You look at the money because that'll give you the answers to everything. And it's interesting. I wonder if part of the problem there is that the housing associations are not commercially dependent on their tenants, where perhaps they should be, whereas actually the private landlord, his tenant is the be-all and end-all of his business or success or failure. So I don't know.
I think you're probably right there.
Roper put a framework together in 2019 for lettings agencies and estate agencies to do a qualification around all of this. Something similar, I think, in place for landlords that are self-managing would be great, and that's for housing associations and everything.
But
everybody should be.
Needs to be balanced in respect of more bureaucracy, more red tape, more paperwork. There's an awful lot at the moment. I think there just needs to be a balance.
Yeah, and this is what I say, the answer is always to bring in a next step or a next qualification, and it's not always the answer to do that, because that can put a lot of good people off. There's far too much red tape, I'm not interested anymore, or there's just too much to keep up with. And in actual fact, the rogue landlords and the rogue tenants don't care about legislation or the law or the contracts, or they're not the people that, well, that's the very definition of rogue, isn't it? They're not paying attention to that, which is almost again adding an extra layer for those of us that are doing it correctly. I'd be quite happy to take a test, or to get that certification.
Yes, but I've looked at some of your publications and your website, and I know that you work in a very ethical way, and I think part of your ethos is that you do things properly or you don't do it at all.
Exactly.
I think that's
what's the point of doing something?
Yeah. But as I say, I think there are a number of organisations that are devoid of any commercial drive, and so their incentive to do things right is perhaps not where it should be. Do you keep anything as a portfolio to lease out as a company?
We do. Occasionally we become an accidental landlord where we perhaps haven't been able to sell everything, so we've let them out, which has proved the sensible thing to do. But we would use a letting agent. Why would you want the hassle of doing it yourself when you can get a competent letting agent? Of course, you've got to find the competent letting agent. Yeah. We've got our own one, so we're okay. Yeah. But it's very important that you do that, and therefore, because again, there are so many regulations that you have to go through. I don't want to be doing that. We want someone else to do it for us, I think is the reality.
In all of our basic training, we go through how to be a landlord as well and understand that side of it, because it's not just about investing in property, it's about, well, what happens if your primary strategy didn't work and you do become an accidental landlord, so we look at all of that, but I think that should be standard across the board. If you're not self-managing, then of course you can just appoint a competent management company and have faith in them, I suppose. But you should still know, in my opinion.
Well, I think so many people look at property as an easy way to, well, they assume it's an easy way to get money. You buy a house and you expect to make money.
I'm not sure they do anymore,
well,
because it really isn't.
Well, we've all learned a few lessons the hard way, haven't we, over the last few years, yes. But
I think it depends what network you're in on that statement there, but...
Okay. Well, I'm just sitting there asking the questions. Yeah. So you've got to do it. Okay, thank you, Hayley. That's a good answer. David, interesting question. With an inevitable increase in demand for housing for the thousands of immigrants arriving in the UK from war-torn areas, economically compromised areas of the world, and places of natural catastrophe, how would the panel suggest facilitating a supply of the inevitably required homes? Should this be a central government responsibility, or should it fall on local councils and therefore directly on local ratepayers to fund? And that's, I think.
I'm glad you got that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, thank you again.
It's a very interesting question, because these houses have got to come from somewhere. We get a lot of publicity saying that, you know, sometimes we're too easy on people coming into this country. Sometimes we're too hard. The Home Office is criticised sometimes for being a bit unfeeling, shall we say, about these things. But you know, in normal people morals, we should say, look, we've got to be receptive to these situations. We've got to help where we can. But it is interesting where people do expect the cost to fall. And I just wondered if, as a developer, you ever get any pressure to.
I think it's got to be a hybrid of everything. Central government's got to take its responsibility and take housing seriously. Unfortunately, changing housing minister every 18 months, 2 years is not going to help. I mean, it's crazy that
When
that
have you known
situation.
one last in office for 2
Well,
years?
they just don't. Exactly, they just don't.
It's 13 in the last 10. It's a standing joke
Yeah,
between
that's what
us.
it is, yeah.
Followed by the local authorities who, as you say, they haven't got an incentive to be able to build property at the correct price. If you said to the local authority, here's X million pounds, we want you to build that estate over there, they wouldn't know how to do it. And
They'd
would
spend
get...
it all on professional fees and nothing would get built.
Wow, it's
Sorry,
100
scratch
no, you're right, and that's part of the problem. There's just not enough incentivization to do it, so it falls back to the private developer, and we will do our bit. We're doing our 25, 35, 40%, whatever it is that we have to build, but we can't be responsible for everything. So maybe they'll look at some kind of extra levy, super profit levy on the large developers, which they can then utilise, but they perhaps should go into partnership with private developers to build these properties somehow. Yes. I think that's the way forward.
I think it's a bit of a dangerous game looking at levies, because we're starting to get a levy about cladding, aren't we, and refurbishing buildings. We start looking at green levies. It's all starting to get a bit much, really, isn't it? I don't know where anybody's ever going to make a profit. You'd love me on one of your courses, wouldn't you, Hayley?
You wouldn't get through the application.
I probably couldn't afford it.
It's difficult. It's difficult as to how we do it. But at the end of the day, it does have to be a hybrid. You can't leave it to the local authorities that have no chance. You can't leave it to the housing associations. They've got layers and layers of bureaucracy and management, and by the time they make a decision, private developers at least make decisions quickly, usually. And I think that's why you have to, I would suggest that the government needs to have some kind of organisation created whereby they take the best brains from private housing, the best brains from private banking or banking generally. You're going to have some local authority and housing association people on there as well. Get them all together and come up with some kind of solution.
I think if I was asked, which I'm not being asked, but I'll say my bit, I think I prefer to see some kind of uniform construction, a little bit like student accommodation, perhaps with key centres dotted around the country so that the spread is fair and level, which is a current buzzword, isn't it? Levelling up. So they would be built at a cost, they would be fairly utilitarian, they'd be fairly sensible, equally competitive in terms of facilities and everything else, and those be used as, shall we say, as starter homes for those coming to this country. And here's your base, here's a good place for you to start from, good place for you to apply for jobs from, and what happens to you from there is up to your
you can build your life from there.
Yeah. But anyway, there we are. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. I've taken up most of it, I think, but there we are. Join me again after the break when we'll be asking David and Hayley some more questions.
You are watching Property TV. You are watching Property TV.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Hayley Andrews and David Galman. Welcome back both. Hayley, your second question. I run an HMO business, but I'm suffering recently from a couple of tenants who are acting in an antisocial way towards other tenants. Under the latest restrictions concerning eviction, would such behaviour be grounds enough for me to ask the courts to have these people leave? I know the HMO licence does seem to allow this, but I understand the law has recently changed. Which would have precedence, the HMO agreement or the latest laws?
There was 3 questions
Yeah.
in there. You only get one. No,
Well, you're only getting paid once.
Okay, so with the antisocial behaviour, they can apply to the court, so they would have to give notice. It is 2 weeks notice, and then apply to the court for a court date. So that would be under a section 8, and I believe it's grounds 12 or 14.
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I'm going to trust you.
So you can go down that route, but in order to go down that route, you would have to have substantial evidence to prove antisocial behaviour. So it very much depends not only where you are within the country, because there's different rules in Wales, Ireland, and of course Scotland to that of England. But I'm assuming that we're talking about England here. Don't know why. Maybe because we're in England.
Perhaps because we're in London.
Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on obviously where you are, you'd need to check it out because there has been new laws that have been passed in Wales and definitely Scotland, with the notice period being a lot longer now. But in England, under a section 8, you can go down the route of eviction if it is severe, but you would have to provide substantial evidence.
Let's just take a pause there. On the evidence, okay, so you over that fortnight period, you put your evidence together, you apply to the court. I've no doubt you'd have to put the evidence into court at that stage.
It becomes a process then.
But I just wonder how long would have to wait for a court date in London at the moment.
How long is a piece of string? So I mean, that's another issue, really. So there really is nothing you can do. The courts are underwater, basically. So getting a court date is, anyone's guess. So I wouldn't like to say.
Yeah. So it could end up being a bit of a pointless process, actually, because if you're on a 6-month tenancy, you could, I mean, especially at the moment, I mean, if it's anything like the criminal courts in London, I mean, you could well go past the 6-month date.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if and where you can. So if the tenants are outside of their fixed term tenancy agreement, then I'd definitely go down the route of a Section 21. It's a much clearer cut process. Of course, that's 2 months clear notice, and then leave a couple of days as well, of course, if you're posting that notice. Of course, but then you still have to apply for a court date. You still have to wait for that court date to come through. But it does tend to be much quicker under a Section 21, which is why many of us landlords use that route when we could actually go down the Section 8 route.
Yeah. Well, it's many years since I've done it, but I think I seem to remember that when you issued an assured short-hold tenancy, which I understand on an HMO, it's a very similar sort of tenancy anyway.
Yeah, it's
same.
just a room only.
I know that certain agencies got in the practice of getting you to sign the Section 21 notice at the point of signing the lease. Can you not do that anymore?
No, you're not allowed to do that anymore.
So you have to give that at the, was it 2-month period or 3-month period?
Yes, so no, you can issue a Section 21 when they're outside of their fixed term.
Okay.
So if they are on a 6-month tenancy agreement, for instance, you can't issue it 2 months into their tenancy. You have to wait for the fixed term to end, issue the Section 21.
So that could take a 6-month tenancy into an 8-month tenancy?
Yeah. Maybe even longer with the courts.
Yeah. Okay, so we've looked at the legal
stretch.
Route, and you've given your comment on that, and we've put the caveat
lots
there.
Lots of evidence is what I would say.
Lots of evidence,
Crime
and lots of time needed too. Any simpler ways of solving it? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm not suggesting a sort of a baseball bat and some wild dogs or something. But no, is it?
No, it really isn't worth it. It can be frustrating as the landlord, I've been in this situation myself with a HMO where all other tenants have left. I've been left with one tenant that isn't paying. They've locked me in the property as well, so they've been abusive, aggressive. And the route is the route, the law is the law. You should always follow it step by step. Don't be pulled into a situation where you retaliate and you end up committing a crime as a result of that.
And I suppose that also the lesson there would be to make sure that all your initial paperwork is in order too.
100%, yeah, 100%. That should all be in place upon signing the tenant up.
I don't suppose these are problems you get every day, David.
No, they're not, but I'm just sitting here thinking you can't even enter into a dialogue with the, use your word again, rogue, with the rogue tenant. You just, because there's no point. He's
there
not
is
gonna
no
listen.
point, yeah.
Who gathers the evidence, and whose opinion is it that it is antisocial behaviour and not antisocial behaviour? It's frustrating. You own the property yourself, it's your own property, but you have such little control over it.
Photographic evidence, statements from other tenants, and a crime reference number is, you know.
Just on a slightly sort of expanded point on tenants and landlords. There's two schools of thought, isn't there, about rent arrears, which are particularly pertinent at the moment. But some people will say to you, well, you know, talk to your tenant, try and enter into some kind of agreement, arrangement, and let it go one thing or another. And then you get another school of thought which says, no, don't. Treat the rent as due on the day. If it's not due on the day, take the normal process of rent recovery and don't falter from that, because you'll only regret it later on down the line, or it'll happen again, or they'll break the agreement that you make or something like that. Well, what's your view?
I think it's always best to talk to the tenant. It's definitely in your interest as a landlord. Of course, some tenants are not interested in talking to you. And you're left with only one option then. But to put a payment plan in place is a much better route than going for eviction.
Yes. Yeah. So time consuming, isn't it?
It is time consuming,
and
costly,
and
it's stressful,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. Especially under the, you know, under circumstances with antisocial behaviour and rent arrears and, you know, and disrupting a household. We're not talking about, you know, a flat here where they've got right of tenure over the whole of the unit. They are sharing with other people. So they're causing an issue in the house. They need to evict them, but they need to go down there is no point in talking to those people. But again, antisocial behaviour can be anything. You know, it could be playing loud music, or perhaps getting up, you know, talking too loud at night, or it really depends on the severity of the case. But I mean, all of the points that I've just made are around, you know, violence and things like that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Hayley. David, your last question. I'm planning to develop a small site I've purchased and turning it into a small block of flats, hopefully around 12. I want the development to have good green credentials, which I hope will add to the marketability. However, some of the green innovations that we're being encouraged to implement these days don't always turn out to be effective and simply add to the costs, both in terms of installation and future running costs. If funds are limited, what would the panel recommend as the most simple and cost-effective options that I have?
Another corker. You're hitting me with them today. A scheme as small as that, a dozen flats or so, something along those lines, I would expect that the local authority would insist on whatever they want to do in the environmental positive way, and to make the development a green scheme so much. Simple things to do would be green roof, probably, which is not expensive to do, and something very, very
That's
very
a
easy.
well-insulated roof.
Correct.
Of what sort of materials?
I don't know the physical name of the materials, but it would be something. You create a garden on the roof that adds to the insulation, and also adds to the aesthetics of the building. Has to be upkept though. That's one of the
and
problems.
And a plus for wildlife, of course.
Well, so I don't know if you've
I
noticed
know we had to do here for the, what do they call, the red hawks?
The red hawks and the bat. Have you seen the cages that are built on the side of areas of these buildings with lots of block work in there and little bricks and so on and so forth? Perfect for someone to grab the wire cutters and chuck the bricks out, but that's also for wildlife. So those kind of things I think are relatively inexpensive and add to the sustainability. When it starts getting a little bit more difficult, more expensive, are these air source heat pump. We've spoken about them before. No one really knows how they work. No one knows how efficient they are yet, but we're being asked to put them in.
And how long it takes to get the capital cost back, really, in real terms?
Long time, I would imagine. I would imagine it's a long time. And I think you and I have spoken before about giant developments where you've put in a communal boiler that runs on pellets and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
They've all been stopped. They've just been stopped, and they don't happen anymore. I guess a scheme of a dozen flats, you could look at solar power in some way. There'll be some solar power, I imagine. That sort of thing.
Okay. Is this a question you get on your courses, Hayley?
No, not really. I mean, obviously we look at improving the energy performance, but majority of people that are coming through are not starting on development, so they're looking at an already structure and just improving that. So it's not a question we get asked often, but of course, you know, it is something that we need to pay attention to now. It's especially as landlords as well.
Do people pay a lot of attention when they're renovating?
Yeah, I think so. But just the, you know, the standard stuff like upgrading the boiler or, you know, of which, you know, they're trying to now get rid of gas boilers. And so we're looking at electric heat pumps and solar panels and, you know, good, decent installation in the roof. Just things like double glazing. Just the standard stuff is still very much in our arena at this moment in time. So we're not looking at roof gardens, although that sounds very interesting. might just look at that on one of the developments I'm doing now.
We won't charge you for that.
Yeah, it's free tip.
Quite interesting though. I was reading an article the other day where people were starting to say, well, look, you know, if the government want to encourage solar heating so much, why have they taken all the grants away from solar heating? Is there an answer to that?
It certainly was abused. It was a scheme that was abused by salesmen that were cottoning on to, hold on a minute, we can sell that system to the little old lady down there because the government are actually going to pay for it and so on. So maybe it was abused, maybe they felt it had run its course. Electric charging points, they're going to become a thing that you're going to have to put in somehow to try and put in one for one in terms of the car spaces. Yeah.
Yes. Although, you know, in some cases, we were talking to a colleague before the show who's had to pay a fortune because he lives in the country to have a carport put in. Yeah. I mean, you know, you could almost buy the electric car cheaper. I think,
yeah.
They're very expensive.
Yeah. Okay.
There are grants for the electric car points though, aren't there?
I think there would be for a private individual. There isn't going to be for you or I in a development situation. We're going to be forced to put them in, I would imagine.
Okay. Well, on that sad note, that's all we've got time for. So, Hayley Andrews, thank you very much for coming down from Birmingham. David Galman, thank you again for coming in to see us. Grateful for your information and help for our viewers. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.